Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning if that's what it is where you are. Welcome to this DDEX webinar focused on the Digital Sales Report Standard. My name is Mark Isherwood, and I will be talking to you along with my colleague Niels Rump. I will just give a fairly brief overview of DDEX, just in case it's new to some of you. And then Niels will be talking about the digital sales report and briefly about its sister standard, the claim detail message. Please ask questions using the chat. There'll be an opportunity for questions at the end as well, but please feel free to do that if you wish, and we will do our very best to answer any questions you have. So as you know, or at least I hope you know, DDEX is a standards development organization focused primarily on the music industry. And the standards we develop are intended to improve efficiency of communication of all the data that needs to flow through the music industry value chain, which, as you know, is a considerable amount, particularly now that we are dealing with streaming. And the way we do that is around three areas. The first one, and probably the most important, is the development of standard formats for messages, for computer messages. And that basically means that we determine what the order of the data points are in a message and how they are linked together, so that when you send a DDEX formatted message, the recipient will know and expect to see certain data types, data points at specific points in the message. And so that's how the standardization occurs. We also standardize choreographies. And what we mean by that is the order in which messages get exchanged and the trigger points that might actually require a message to be sent. And these are all set down as part of the standards. And then finally, the actual protocols by which the messages are actually exchanged. Up until the last 3 or 4 years, that's primarily been standardizing the way in which business partners exchange messages using secure FTP sites. But increasingly, our standards are also specifying web service exchange, which is much more about computer to computer communication, obviously involves less human interaction, and is a way of increasing efficiency across this whole space. And we anticipate that that will become a more and more common part of the DDEX ecosystem. DDEX operates like a lot of standards organizations. We have a series of technical working groups. Most of those are now sort of standing working groups in that they look after a particular set of standards. And mostly what they go through, the process they go through, is setting requirements, reviewing any proposed solutions, which is the creation of the solutions is the role that the Secretariat plays. And then we go through an iterative process of discussion on the proposed solutions until we get to a point where everybody is comfortable with the standards or with the proposed solution. And then we go through a formal process whereby all of the membership of DDEX gets the opportunity to comment, and assuming there are no significant comments, the standard is signed off by the board, and then we eventually make that public. The meetings of working groups, particularly at the moment, are virtual, usually telephone conferences, but because we're not meeting physically, we like to see each other's faces, so we're obviously using technology like this. We are sharing documents online on a Basecamp site as well. And up until the beginning of this year, a couple of times a year, all of the members of DDEX would get together at plenary meetings, physical plenary meetings, which would be hosted on a rotation basis between the east and west coast of North America and Europe. And that could involve, upwards of 200 people. And that's where we bring all of the information about what the technical working groups have been doing separately, gives everybody a chance to catch up on what's going on. But also we spend a lot of time working on common problems, of which there are often many. These are issues that affect all of the standards, and so we need to be all together to come up with solutions that work for all of the different working groups. The working group progress is reviewed and recommendations are then made to the board in terms of work items going forward. And so each 6-monthly plenary is really a way of setting the agenda for the subsequent 6 months. We also meet physically, maybe on a specific topic or for a regional meeting, particularly where a working group has got a very long list of work items. It is sometimes worthwhile meeting together for a couple of days to really thrash through what the issues are. The key point about all these meetings is that they come to decision through consensus. And if you consider the music industry can be quite litigious, and a number of our members are very often in heated litigation with each other, all of that gets left at the door when it comes to DDEX, and people very much work together, both with their competitors, but also with organizations that they may be in dispute with. And that is very much a key of why DDEX has been so successful, because we have encouraged this atmosphere of cooperation, and it works extremely well. At the moment, DDEX has 8 families of standards. What I mean by that is that although the standards are usually known in the singular, many of them contain more than one message format, so they are sort of grouped together as a family. And as you can see here, the types of companies within the music industry ecosystem are exchanging different types of messages because of the specific transactions or business transactions that they need to carry out. And although the standards therefore have to have differences because of this particular nature of the business transaction taking place, they are all built on common building blocks, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So although there are differences, there are also significant amounts of commonality between all of our standards as they are used for different types of business transactions. The focus of today, though, is to look at the digital sales report, which is standards, which is known as sales and usage reporting. And this is primarily a message that is sent from DSPs to rights owners, whether they be rights owners of musical works like authors, rights societies and music publishers, owners or administrators, and also to record companies in respect of sound recordings. One of the last points I would make in terms of the introduction is the underpinning of DDEX's standards is through the data dictionary. It is the lingua franca of the music industry. If you don't speak DDEX, for want of a better phrase, you will struggle to be able to communicate with your business partners, and will probably have to use multiple proprietary standards. So DDEX is now very much a part of the industry. The data dictionary contains all the semantics of all the terms of all the messages. But also, as I hinted at earlier, it contains the sort of structure of some of the building blocks that we use commonly throughout the standards, which we call composites. And basically, these composites are certain data points organized in a specific way, which are used to describe different types of entities. So there is a composite that describes sound recordings or musical works or parties, including artists and publishers and whoever that may be, whether individuals or legal entities. And you will find across all of the standards, these composites appear very commonly all over the place, and very much are the building blocks upon which all of the standards are created. So that's all I wanted to do in terms of an introduction. I'm now going to pass on to my colleague Niels, who will start to talk about the DSR standard in some detail.
All standards, at least that's what I used to say, use XML as its language. The reason for using XML as a language to express these composites that Mark has talked about, and I'll let you know, Katja, where the DDEX data dictionary is in a moment. They are hierarchical structures. You have a release, an album that contains sound recordings, that contains musical works. Each of the musical work has a rights controller. Rights controller has a company associated with it, has a date associated with it, has a territory associated with it. That's all hierarchical data, which is why DDEX standards traditionally were XML messages. Sales and usage information is different though. Sales and usage information is something that you can typically put into a spreadsheet. And that's why DSR is one of the few standards that deals, or that has been developed as a flat file variant. Now, traditionally, or the first DSR standard that we've developed was also XML, because we used XML everywhere. As I said, we just noted that actually the files became far too big. Flat files are at least 10, sometimes up to 100 times smaller than the XML counterparts, partly because XML has lots of data or lots of characters, lots of space in these tags, which is not needed in flat file, but also because of the structure that we actually had. The structure required people to first look at all, or parse and ingest all the description of the releases, all the description of the resources, the sound recordings, all the description of the musical works, before getting to the sound record, the usage information. The XML approach that we have taken is different. All the data is in little small chunks of data, blocks we call them, and it's all the usage information for a specific recording in a specific release for a specific musical work, and everything is in one place. So the flat files can be processed in portions, much more flexibility for ingesting. And that gives you business flexibility, because you can report different business models much easier than in the old XML format. It allows us to adapt the standard much easier to deal with new business models, and makes the ingestion, primarily the ingestion, but also the creation of those files much easier. And that has a direct impact to the cost. The XML variant was much more expensive to develop, to maintain, and to implement than the flat file variant that we have now. So what do I mean by flat file? Flat file is unfortunately not always flat file. Flat file in this case it's a tabulator separated file. So all the columns in the file are separated by tabs. We also allow, for example, to have multiple data points in a single cell sometimes. That is, for example, to allow multiple writers to be communicated. It's no use to have, for example, 10 columns free for writer information if you need to communicate 11 writers. Therefore, it's much better to have one cell with writers, and in that cell you can allow multiple writers to be communicated, and we use the pipe character to support this kind of structure, if you like. That then, of course, means that the pipe character cannot be used in artist names or in titles, which is why we enable to escape those characters and then communicate them as if they were part of the title. Also critical, DDEX is a global standards organization. We expect and hope that our standards are used all over the world. Therefore, we need to be able to handle all kinds of script and languages, and what better to use than UTF-8 for this. But the format is also structured. Not as structured, not as hierarchical as XML, but it is still structured. And that means that we have different record types. We still have the need to describe releases, resources, works, and usage information. So we have a different record type for each of those types of entities. We also have a header and a footer in every file to enable you to say who sent the message to whom and how many lines are in the file to make sure that everybody knows whether the file has arrived as a whole or whether something got lost. And also critical, we have summary lines. We have lines at the top of the DSR file that provides summary information so that you don't need to look and add up all the usage numbers, for example, but you can see at the top how much money is involved in this sales report. Again, something that the XML variant did not allow for. This version allows for it. So the standard defines different record types, as we call them. We call the lines records. We have headers and footers, summary records, and then we have release resource records that describe what is being used, and sales usage records that tell you how much those things that have just been described are being used. Very important is the ability to group those sales and release resource records together and to be able to point from one record to another record. And we do that with local identifiers within each of those records. It's also important, by the way, to uniquely identify each sales usage record, because you may want to reference that sales and usage line in a claim message. In the CDM message, I'm going to talk about that briefly at the end of this little overview. If a licensor wants to claim a specific portion of a musical work in response to a sales message, they need to tell the licensee exactly which sales line they are referring to. Therefore, we need to have a unique identifier of those records, which we do. And then, as I said at the beginning, quite important, you have these self-contained blocks that describe releases and their usages, and you don't need anything else than just these records to be able to ingest them. That means that you can split your sales usage report. If it's too big, on Monday you just process the first half, and on Tuesday you can process the second half. You don't need to do it all in one go if that's what you want to do. So this is then the overall structure of all the sales usage reports. You have the header record, you have a number of summary records, then you have those individual blocks. How those blocks look like in different profiles, as we call them, for different commercial setups, I'll talk about that in a moment. And at the end, you have the footer. I said, and that is certainly true, that we have different record types and we have these blocks. But these blocks are and can be comparatively complex. It might be, some people in the working group argued, that we should actually have one line, one very long record that contains all the information. What has been used, release, resource, work, and how it has been used and how much money has been generated through that line. Which means, of course, that when you have an album of 10 tracks, you would need to describe the album information 10 times for each of those records that describe each of the sound recordings, musical works, and sales and usage information. Moreover, if you then have the whole thing being used in 10 different territories, for example, you now need to have the release information repeated 20 times and each of the resource information repeated twice. So it's fairly inefficient, very easy to ingest, very easy to understand, but it's quite inefficient to process or to generate, which is why we have the more efficient multi-record block variant, where you have first the release then the resources, and then you have the different sales usage records, which may just be, in this case, in the example that I gave you, 2 sales usage records for 2 different territories. Much fewer or much less duplication of data, but it's a more complex setup. And it's basically complexity versus file size that we had to weigh up. And because there is no clear winner in this contest, we support both, at least for some of the profiles. If you have a smaller catalog and or a smaller IT team and cannot deal with complex, slightly more complex files, use the single record block variant. If you have larger catalogs, then use the multi-record block variant. The other way of saving space is to use what we call multi-context reports. Traditionally, what has been reported are single context reports. So they cover one territory, one currency, one commercial model, one use type, and one service tier or one service type. So you have, for France, pay-as-you-go download, payable in euros, and it's just the student tier, for example. But especially when you're dealing with international companies and international licensees and licensors, if you broaden this up to 3 territories, for example, now it's Belgium, France, and Germany, you would need to send basically the same information 3 times, 3 reports with all the metadata, titles, artist names, writer names, publisher names, all of that needs to be sent in 3 files. Well, wouldn't it be more efficient if we would send 1 file, you describe the stuff once, and then you have just 3 sales and usage lines? Yes, it would be more efficient. It's more complex, the setup, but again, we support both depending on what the companies involved, the sender, the licensor, and the licensee rather, and the recipient, the licensor, would want to deal with. And we refer to this combination of those 5 aspects as the sales context, which is why it's a single context or a multi-context report. So this is how a sales report looks like. And because you can't read that, let me blow that up for you. This is now quite colorful. In real life, they're black and white. It's a CSV file or TSV file, so there is no color in there. But there are some aspects that are worthwhile pointing out, and it's much easier to do that with color than in black and white. First of all, there are these lines that all start with a hash symbol or pound symbol, as it's sometimes called in North America. I see your question, Kevin. I'll come to that in a moment. Those are not formally part of the sales usage report, but they are quite helpful to put into there. They contain all the column headings, if you like. So you have in the second row, the first white row there, the list of cells that are in the header record: message version, profile version, message ID, message created date time, and the like. And then you have, for the summary 01 record, you have summary record ID, distribution channel, and so forth. So that makes the report really, really nice, humanly readable. And the whole thing is bracketed, if you like, by header and footer. The header, the very first line, is always the header, tells you who sends it to whom, when it was sent. And the footer is always the last one. And in this case, there are 35 lines in the file, 35 lines in the report. A report can be split over multiple files if need be. I don't think anybody uses that feature. And there's one summary record in the file and one summary in the whole report. And oops, there's a mistake. It should say that there is one number of blocks in the report. So there you can see those things that we're dealing with. And some of those are now visible of the question that Kevin has asked. The sales context has, as I said, 5 aspects. Which territory and currency is used? I think that's pretty clear. Use types is how the consumer interacts with the music. That's download versus streaming, webcast, and those kind of activities that the user does. But the typical use cases are stream and permanent download. commercial model is how the consumer pays. Is it a pay-as-you-go? Is it an ad-supported model, or is it a subscription service? And then there are the different service tiers. If you're going with Spotify, for example, as an example, either you are on the free-to-use model or tier. Sometimes some people pay a certain subscription, others pay a family subscription. They are different service tiers, and based on those service tiers, the royalty rates may, for example, differ. That's what the service tier signals. Good. So we're then going further into the report, and now we're talking about the SY record, the summary record number 1, and that defines actually which those 5, the sales context is now being defined. So you see the first bits here. It's pay-as-you-go model, permanent download in France. The next column then would in all likelihood be the currency, and the next line will in all likelihood be the service type. And then we have the block, and there is only one block shown in here. In green, in blue, dark blue at the top, that's the release that has been used. So that's the album that has been downloaded or from which different tracks have been streamed. In red, you see all the individual sound recordings. So in the middle, you see the ISRC for those tracks. In blue at the bottom, those are the sales usage lines. And then there are green lines in the middle, which we call sub-releases. And they are to allow things like complete my album. So if a consumer has already bought 3 tracks from that album, and they now want to buy the album, there is no need for them to basically pay again for those 3 tracks that they have already been paid, that they have already paid for. And this reduction basically needs to be reflected in the sales usage report by basically saying that the consumer now bought this album, but actually they only bought those 7 tracks because those 3 aren't there anymore. And I'll show how that is being expressed in a second. These ones here, they all indicate that they are block number 1. These all belong together. So all of those sound recordings are part of that release at the very top. And all of those sub-release records are sub-releases of that release at the top. And all of those sales and usage numbers at the bottom are part of the block about this one release. This just contains one block. The next block then would be in all likelihood number 2, number 3, and so forth. These at the bottom right are all those pointers that I've talked about. If we're looking at the very last SU record, which points to 19, that is a sales and usage of the last of the 3 sub-releases, which has in its third column a 19. And above 18 and 17, those were the sales and usages of those 3 sub-releases. And the third of those sub-releases comprises of tracks 11 and 12. Those would be the 24 Prelude and Fugues, Opus 87, and the Symphony number 10, the Allegro of that. And the second of those sub-releases comprises of track number 1. Oh dear, there is a bug. There is no track number 1, but track 4 would be the Gadfly Opus 97, and number 5 is also Gadfly Opus 97. Seems to be 2 recordings of the same work on that album. The first of those sales usage records that has a 1 in there, that points to release number 1. That's the overall album. So someone has bought the entire album or has downloaded the entire album. The next 2 lines, that's just individual tracks that have been used. These number 1s are pointers to the summary record that I've talked about at the beginning. That means that all of these sales and usage records are actually part of this permanent download in France based on a pay-as-you-go model. If this were a multi-context report, you would have 2 sales lines, 2 summary lines, and then you have potentially different numbers here in the SU, in the third column of the SU record. One that points to the permanent download in France and one that points to the permanent download in Belgium, for example. These funny letter and number combinations at the beginning, they identify each of those records. So this is an AS02.01 record. AS is for asset or sound recordings in this case. Resource would be the formal DDEX term for it. That's the term used in the DDEX data dictionary, except that we can't use RE for resource because we've already used RE for release. So we had to find something else. So it's AS, and it's the second of the AS records that we have developed, and it's the first iteration of this. RE01 is the first release record that we've developed. RE02 is the second release record that we have developed. In that case, that's the sub-release record. We have developed a number of profiles, 7 profiles: basic audio, UGC, user-generated content, audio-visual, royalty reporting, broadcast profile, radio broadcast profile, a profile for financial reporting to record companies, and a master list profile. Some of those come in single record block variant and multi-record block variant, those with an asterisk, and one, that's the label reporting, comes only as a single record block variant. They have a much simpler setup, because if you want to report to a record company, they are the ones that actually provide the DSP with the metadata to report back. So in effect, you just need the identifier of that they sent you back then when they sent you an ERN message, and then the financial information going back. Whereas if you're talking to a music rights society or a music publisher, you need to describe release, resource, musical work. It's a much more complex setup, which is why we've started developing those in multi-record block variants. It's those 7 profiles that we have, but we also have a number of general parts in which we document them. So each of the profile is documented in one separate standard, and that's parts 3 to 7 and 8 and 9 and 10. And then the first 3 lines here, part 1, part 2, part 8, are common to all of the profiles. The general architecture that defines that it's a separated value file, that we use UTF-8, defines the delimiters, defines the file naming convention. Those things are all in part 1. Part 2 provides the allowed value set or the code lists that defines the different values for those use types and commercial model type and so forth. And then the record type definition that sets out how the layout is for the different rows in the reports, that's in part 8. Because all of the profiles make use of the same record types. The summary the header, footer, the RE01 and RE02 are used in multiple profiles. So it's no point in documenting them multiple times. So there's only one place where they are documented. So this is how the basic audio profile looks like. We already looked at it to some extent in the example. So each of those blocks can now cater for albums, can cater for singles, can cater for music videos. So you have this, what we call the head release. That's the album that has been transacted. In a streaming context, that is basically the page that you see on your streaming service provider, from which you will then stream the individual songs. Underneath each of those head releases, you then need to list all the resources that have been used. If it's for a download service, it will be all the resources there are. If it's a streaming service, there is a chance that some of the tracks have never been streamed, therefore they can be omitted from this list. There are 2 ways in which you can then describe them. Either you provide an AS02 record, which is the metadata for the resource and the musical work. So it gives you information about the title of the sound recording, of the display artist, the duration of the music, but it also then contains writer information, publisher information, and those kind of things. So it's resource and work information. But in some cases where there are multiple musical works involved, that doesn't work. or maybe sometimes you do not know which musical work. You don't have any of that information. In that case, you can use an AS01 record, which is like the AS02 record, except that it's curtailed at the end. There is no work information in there. It is just the resource information. And in that case, you can append an MW01 record, musical work 01 record, which has also been updated since its original inception, which then contains the writer information and so forth. And then in blue, you have the sales usage records, and in between you have these sub-release records. And the top of those two green sub-release records, that's one that contains of 2 tracks, resource 2 and 4, and the other one that just contains of 1 track. And the sales usage records then point to either the head release or those sub-releases, and that then contains all the information that you need to see how often has something been used. What's not shown here is the pointer from those sales usage records to the summary records. In some cases, a DSP doesn't even have information from which release sound recording is being taken. And in that case, there is a simplified way of communicating this stuff. You just have a resource and the sales usage lines. Either work with musical work information or without it, and then you can have additional musical work records in it. The pointers that I showed on the previous diagram apply here in the same way. They're just not shown here. The audiovisual profile looks exactly the same as the basic audio profile, with one difference. The musical work record is now replaced by a cue record. Basically provides you the ability to communicate a movie or a season or an episode of a season of a movie, those kind of things. And you can then communicate which piece of music is used where for what particular purpose. Is that background music, foreground music? Is it the intro, outro? All of those kind of aspects of embodied works. You still have the sub-releases and you still have the sales usage records. The head release and the resource records are slightly different because we need to have slightly different pieces of information that needs to be communicated. But the overall structure, if you understand the basic audio profile, you will be immediately familiar with the audiovisual profile. Radio broadcast is also similar. You have a release, you have a number of resources, but underneath that, you then have directly the usage rather than pointing to it. But because in this case, the usage will always be with respect to resource, will never be with respect to release. Therefore, the whole concept of either pointing to a resource or to a release or to pointing to a different sub-release doesn't exist. Therefore, we could simplify the whole thing. And it's used for usage reporting for broadcasts in many territories. So you may have quite a number of sales usage lines underneath there rather than just one. One of the interesting things that happened when we developed the claim detail message is that we realized that the DSR standard did not cater for an interesting way of communicating things. Traditionally, the DSR contains sales and usage information, as well as information about how often and for what money something has been streamed or downloaded. But in some cases, DSPs would like to communicate work information to works licenses before they actually start selling the stuff, or while they were making the stuff available, before any financial information and usage information is available. That's a pre-claim process, as we call it. And the master list profile allows that. It just communicates the resources that have been used as part of a release, and then provide potential work information about musical works that have been used in a resource. For example, let's go to YouTube, for example. They have a video, that's a resource, and then in there are different pieces of music, different master recordings are used there. So you can communicate those kind of setups in this profile. Quite neat, I think. UGC is basically like the master list profile, except This is now for provision of sales and usage information. How often has a specific piece of music been actually used in which YouTube video or whatever it may be as a user-generated content service. And then we have a royalty reporting profile, which is again similar to the basic audio profile, with the addition that you can provide here not only sales and usage information, but then also sales and usage information for different licensors within the same report. So you can provide, here's a resource, a release, here's a resource. Here is sales and usage information for the resource. And this sales and usage information is now being split, if you like, to this licensor to that amount, to this licensor to that amount, to this licensor to that amount. That makes reporting of UGC and combinations of different use types quite powerful. And last but not least, we have financial reporting to labels. As I said, that's only in single block variant available, and it allows reporting of sales and usage to record companies. We are looking, or we were looking, that has kind of gone to a back burner, to look at marketing reports, which are much more detailed, which indicates where individual usages happen rather than usages on summary, that a specific sound recording has been used 500 times, for example. These marketing reports is something that may come at a later stage. Before we come to close, I just wanted to, and Katja, I know I still owe you an answer to your question. I just wanted to briefly go to the flow of information back from the licensor to the licensee, which is the CDN. We want to allow the reporting by licensees of the level of sales, of usages and revenue to licensors. We've just talked about that. That's DSR. But we want to do the other thing as well, for the licensors of musical works to make claims with respect to those usages of those works. And that is what we call the claim detail message, CDN. So we have two different principal messages, the sales report message, we've talked about that. And then we have the opposite message, the claim detail message for communicating claims and invoice details. DSR deals with works and sound recordings, claim message deals with musical works only. As I said earlier, the DSR used to be XML, has been phased out or is being phased out, though there are still a number of implementations that are being used. I would though strongly recommend not to start an XML implementation at this stage. If you want to use DSR, use the flat file, or DSRF as it was called in the past. CDM, that's just flat file, and it uses the same architecture. It uses the same row setup, header, footer, summary, and blocks as the DSR format. And the overall choreography is basically that you have a DSR flowing from licensee to licensor. That can be technically acknowledged. You have then a CDM message, a claim message flowing back. And then the licensee can ingest that and can see what claims are being made, whether those claims make sense from their perspective, and if not, they can then provide what we call a discrepancy report, either with respect to an individual line, because the maths is wrong, because the wrong royalty rate has been applied, because the wrong currency conversion has been applied, or whatever the reason may be. But it can also deal with overclaim discrepancies, where two licensors have claimed 60%, which is more than 100%. Therefore, there is something fishy. So you can then reply back to both of those companies and saying, sorry, you two, can you please sort out who owns this stuff so that I can pay people? Yes, Kevin, there is a way to escape the pipe character or escape the tab character. It's in part one of the standard, and it's the same escaping mechanism in CDM as it is in DSR. So if you know it once, you know it for both. As I said, those two standards use the same architecture, the same allowed values, the same escaping mechanism, the same delimiters. We have a way of precisely referencing an individual claim or invoice detail. Those two standards are just made to work with one another. There are other claim standards out there, but they all are for the one for one more geared towards downloads, this is not just downloads, it's downloads and UGC and streams. But also this pointing from claim to a specific sales usage line has proven to be rather tricky and inconsistent between different implementations of, for example, the CCID format. That is what I wanted to say, but Katja, the answer to your question. When you go to the knowledge base, which is at kb.ddex.net, knowledgebase.ddex.net, that's where all the standards are documented and where there's a lot of additional tips and tricks. Amongst there is a section for the DSR standard, and amongst that there's a section for the CDM standard. If you go there, on the very right-hand side, you find a blue box which talks about accessing the latest data dictionary, and that's where you can see the latest dictionary. But be warned, there are several editions for that data dictionary. Each of the standard has its own version of the data dictionary, because they're always cut for the terms that are just used for that particular standard. So the ERN data dictionary looks like its own data dictionary, but it's just the ERN edition of the overall DDEX data dictionary. If you can't find it, drop us an email at info@ddex.net, and I'll point you that way.
Thank you, Niels. Are there any more questions? Okay. Well, if you think of something as soon as you come off the call or in a day or two, you can use that address info@ddex.net to make a query. Those emails come to myself and Niels, and we will obviously do our very best to respond. So thank you for attending this webinar. I hope you found it helpful and enjoy what's left of the rest of your day. So thanks very much, and bye-bye.